वेलकम टू नेशन स्टेट डायलॉग सीरीज राष्ट्र राज्य संवाद श्रृंखला में आपका स्वागत है. 欢迎收看民族国家对话系列. I'm Dr. Geeta Kochhar, moderator for today's discussion. In our special series, Perspectives of Women on China, today we have the privilege to invite Professor Ravni Thakur, who is a professor for Chinese Studies at the Department of East Asian Studies, Delhi University. She has in the past been director of the Euro-Asia Institute and professor for Chinese Studies at the International Academy Jamia Millia Islamia University. She has Masters in Development Studies from the Institute of Development Studies, the Hague, and a Ph.D. from a Sinology Institute, University of Leiden, the Netherlands. She has taught at the Institute of Oriental Languages and Civilizations, Sorbonne Paris, before joining Delhi University in 2003. She has been a senior fellow at the Delhi Policy Group and a senior fellow at the BRICS Policy Research Institute in Rio de Janeiro. And she has published widely in various international and national journals. And her recent publication is China in the 21st Century, which was published in 2020. So very warm welcome to you, madam, in the Nation State Dialogue special series, Perspectives of Women on China. So let me begin by asking you, and this is going to be a little more focused on Chinese society and the changes that are happening. So let me begin by asking, the complexity that we have in the Chinese society, but there are, many undercurrents which are changing the nature of the society. So can you please throw some light on the relationship between the Chinese state party and Chinese society, and how do they interact, and what is the difference compared to other democratic societies, especially when we compare with India?
Thank you so much, Dr. Geeta Kochhar. And first, may I congratulate you on creating a forum through which we can communicate in dialogue on China, which is, as we all know, a very, very important neighbor of India. I'm especially intrigued that you've asked me on your platform to speak from a woman's perspective. And I am going to try and bring that up when I talk about state-society relations, because I think one normally tends to forget that gender is an extremely important factor, both in state policy and in the kind of society that exists as such. Now, you're specifically talking about a state and society relationship, and that in itself is a very, very complex term, except to say that I think China does have the credit of having that first state, as it were, a group of people, what the Chinese call Guanliao, that bureaucratic structure as a specific component of administrating a complex society like China. And in the ancient period, China was a very highly developed society, extremely complex. It was really, we all know that, even in terms of economy, the Indian and Chinese economy is really made up more than 25% of the world GDP prior to the 17th century. So that also entailed a great degree of complexity in state-society relations. And China had that bureaucratic structure, which in the beginning, by the 1st century AD, it had taken on specific forms. And right from the beginning, you see this centralized, top-down structure of administration in China. And another very strong ingredient of this state is its very, very strong of the state itself are propagated through those who also become members of this Guanliao, the literati. And right from there, you see this normative social ideals, whether we are talking about filial piety, whether we are talking about loyalty to the state, whether we are talking about, other parameters, the 5 relationships that Confucius specifies, for example, where the emperor is the father of the family, so to speak. So a very strong relationship is built between the state and society right from the very beginning. Even in terms of its economic goals, the Chinese states, in many ways, scholars have argued, the Chinese states uses its peasantry as a form of soft expansion of its own territory. Peasants are sent out, because China also has this very interesting, and again in terms, unique law of inheritance where property can be shared equally between all male heirs. And that divides properties. Now, the Chinese state right from the beginning creates this rule so as to not allow a large feudal entity to grow that might challenge the power of the Chinese state. At one point in history, in the late 8th century, when Buddhism starts becoming very, very strong and starts almost appearing as an alternative social, place, as well as challenging the Chinese state in terms of huge economic wealth, the Chinese state hits back. And, thousands of monks are defrocked, monasteries, wealth of monasteries is confiscated, etc. So right from the beginning, you see a very, very strong Chinese state that is constantly trying to control social relations. And the reason I'm talking about this is because the communists, when they come to power in 1949, may couch it in Marxian discourse. But the overall relationship of the state as a controlling entity towards society only becomes greater. Mao brings even more detail in the control of society. And in fact, Mao's cultural wars are not just against intellectuals, they are actually, the olds are also that of family and kinship, those basic social structures, which in the imperial period, they didn't really interfere with. Even, the Chinese state was comparatively small. There were very few counties, there were very few magistrates, etc., etc. And there was a far greater degree of diversity. But with the communists coming to power, their propensity for control of the Chinese state is magnified 100-fold. Mao replaces, social organizations like kinship and family by the Tanwei, by the commune, which are supposed to actually operate like families. Personal relationships don't count, it's tongzhi. The category, the communization of identity, where the personal is totally eroded. You have sort of constant surveillance, you have constant campaigns, one campaign after the other, constant rounds of peepings, criticism and self-criticism, all manners through which Mao wants to reform society totally. He attaches a great deal of importance to that. And it's extremely, extremely effective because really under communism, the state becomes the only purveyor of any goods. There is no alternative to dependence on the state. And thereby you do see a very, very direct control being exercised on the personal under communists. Even the right to marry, where your children are going, what Tanwei you're going to get, there is no personal independent choice. All of it is taken care of by the state. The Tieko, the Tieko Fan, the iron rice bowl, as it was called, also became a rice bowl in which the personal was sacrificed. With the coming of and market economy, which naturally needs a different kind of organization structure. After all, you have to make the individual responsible for competition. If you have to reintroduce competition, then you have to rework social relations. Instead of creating that vertical dependency on the state, you have to now shift societal patterns to recreate those horizontal networks that exist through families, relatives, kinships, schools, universities, those horizontal networks that we all create in our lives to get on in society, where the family becomes a key unit. So with his agricultural reform, first and foremost with the household responsibility system, he creates the family again as not just the basic economic accounting unit, but also that unit which will be the focus of government campaign, will allow the nurturing, will take over the welfare activities of the state, will take over those nurturing dependencies that the Tanwei and commune system was fulfilling. And literally, one must say, I mean, I was studying in China through, throughout the Tang period, so one has had the privilege of seeing many things change in come and go, and literally the personal is reconstituted. And what you do see in Tang's period is a huge revival of tradition. Now, this is where change is quite interesting, because one of the changes that were positive as far as I'm concerned, in the Maoist period, and one can take that with a pinch of salt, is the importance that he gave to the role of women. Mao's "Women hold up half the sky" was actually a very, very important slogan. It did legitimize women moving out of that personal space, that space of the house, those four walls in which tradition confined Chinese women, and legitimizing their roles in the making of a modern China. His women heroines, the women workers, there was a great, and I've talked to many, many women across China who would assent to the freedom that suddenly, or legitimacy, even though they continue to be discriminated, whether it's in wages, the kind of jobs they have, etc., gender stereotypes continue. But what you see in Tang's period with the revival of the private is also many traditions coming back, which are actually not really good for gender. You see arranged marriages coming back, you see bride price coming back, you see prostitution and other ills that are part of, more mercantile and more monetary societies like China has come. Because I don't want to really use the term capitalism, we tend to confuse this category. China is very much a state capitalist. So where state and society relations are concerned, I don't think the dialogue has changed. The state, to a very large extent, still controls what the person, the individual in China can do. It's still a very strong centralized state. But during Tang's period, the boundaries became wider. Far more things were permitted, were allowed. The state stopped literally on a day-to-day basis interfering in your lives. There was a greater degree of freedom in the content of social media, in the content of journals, etc. I'm sure you are also aware of these things. With Xi Jinping, again, we are seeing, it's really, this is something I've learned about China since I started going there, first time in 1982, is that nothing stands still in China. I mean, when Tang started his reforms, we thought they were there to stay, that it would be a movement to greater democratization, that the state would pull back further. 1989 and Tiananmen put an end to that. But after that, especially after Tang's southern tour, we find, reform revives, freedoms revive, etc. There's this push to join the WTO by 2001, and many things are allowed largely because of that. And again, one thing's all right, that's going to be there. The private sector is wholly legitimized, and the private sector becomes very big. And in fact, is the moving agent in China's economic growth, in the name that Chinese companies have made for themselves internationally. I mean, it's not a joke that Huawei is such a giant that America has to call upon its allies to hold back on allowing 5G networks from Huawei. So one thought that would continue, that the state would remain a place which is really in control, but it would sheathe its claws. Again, with Xi Jinping, we realize we were wrong. Xi has again moved the clock back. He's reinforcing the primacy of the party everywhere. The party agent is now a must in every organization again, including the private sector. So to sum up, because I'm sure there are other questions, to sum up, the state-society dialogue in China, where you constantly see a strong central state that is not averse to using any instrument of force to ensure that nothing else can challenge its power, is not new to communist China. In fact, they fit in very well. And today, actually, the Chinese state is couching its legitimacy more and more in Confucian discourse. The meritorious path to becoming a Mandarin, the meritorious path to becoming a cadre who's a part of the government ranks. All their leaders today are highly technocratic. Li Keqiang has a Ph.D. in economics from Beijing University. Xi Jinping has a degree from Tsinghua University in chemical engineering. So multi change that has occurred in the party has been further reinforced by Xi Jinping by giving it primacy, both through traditional discourses as a Confucian literary that cares for the welfare of people, and within the communist discourse by harping on the need to look after the poor, elimination of poverty, taking on that mantle of communism on the one hand. So quite interesting, Geeta. I think it will be, fascinating to see to what degree Xi Jinping curtails those freedoms that that golden age of China, as I like to say, till 2013, 14, where one could go and stay with friends and, their families all over China. I think that is past, those interactions that we were freely able to have. And we're seeing, again, a very controlling, micromanaging state appear under Xi Jinping.
Yeah, very, very interesting. You have taken us from the historic times to the present times and the to and fro that is happening in the state's control over the Chinese society. And of course, we see there are, different kinds of controls which are coming. And there was more talk about the social credit systems being a kind of control to the society and all of that. Thank you very much for that. But let's move to, how the society is reacting now. It's considering the pandemics and its, first major hotspot being the Wuhan. How do you see the Chinese people are reacting to the state policies and actions? Do you see a difference in attitudes of Chinese people towards the government from the time of spread in Wuhan to now as it has spread to the world? I mean, if yes, what changes you identify and the reasons behind that? I mean, there must be a backlash from the society as well.
Geeta, that's a difficult question for me to answer. I dislike answering questions about China secondhand, and I haven't been able to visit China in the last 2 years. So again, my information on this is really coming from various sources, as I'm sure you're aware, for all of us who've been in and out of China all our lives, literally. Hong Kong and Taiwan become alternative sources. Hong Kong is something that makes me really sad at the moment, and Hong Kong University research on what is happening within China, it was unsurpassable. They were really, really knowledgeable about events in China. So in that sense, this is secondhand what I talk about, because like I said, I haven't been able to visit China, but I think that, if you saw a gentleman who exposed the COVID virus in Wuhan and who subsequently died of the disease himself. If you remember, he was castigated very heavily in the beginning, and he was even sort of, taken, put under confinement. It was only when there was a huge public backlash on social media that the Chinese state turned around and started feting him as a hero. Similarly, if you look at the diary that Fang Fang wrote, this Wuhan journalist who recorded the period of the lockdown in Wuhan, that the United States, because she was again, we are seeing the same thing. I don't know if you've been watching on YouTube the horrible, and I would like to use your forum to condole the terrible floods that have taken place in Changzhou and Henan, and terrifying scenes that appeared. But again, you see this attempt of the Chinese government to whitewash what is happening, and on the other hand, you see other modes of information that are actually really happening. So I think that, one of the reasons that perhaps Xi Jinping is sort of emphasizing the primacy of the party and creating more, I would even use the term, well, I don't even think it's completely exaggerated, if I use the term Orwellian surveillance society that is coming into being in China. You mentioned the social credit system. I find that quite frightening. And now China is also going to become totally, over a couple of years, even I would put it under a very short time frame, really, paperless, especially in urban areas. All your money spending will also be constantly monitored, because you will no longer be dealing in cash. Everything will be done through cards, through the internet, etc. So I think that, it is that surveillance, the use China has shown the use of modern technology for surveillance purposes, and it's exported that idea for surveillance purposes. What is more interesting, you find, like I said, it's very hard right now, given how controlling space China has become, to really have first-hand experience. One is getting it from other areas, but certainly, people are aware. I think even the recent sort of, I wouldn't even call it movement, but wave that started in China amongst youngsters, which was very much noted in the international media, camping, lie flat, or to go, or more fun, to copy a Buddhist, to be to sort of pull back from the rat race. I think these are sort of indicators that all is not always well, that big sort of constantly growing dream may have become too much for the middle class to sustain. And the international pushback, that is coming from America and now its allies, whether it's over 5G, whether it's, institutions like the Quad that are being activated. That too is sort of, you actually see a dual response in China. On the one hand, it has helped cement Xi Jinping's position as a strong man, someone who can stand up to the West. I'm sure you heard his speech at the the celebrations on the 100-year celebrations of the CCP. I'm sure you heard his speech, and that was fairly direct in terms of telling the West that anybody who messes with China has had it, and reasserting its control over Taiwan. So it has strengthened both that version of Chinese nationalism, but at the same time, coupled with the simultaneous attacks on big IT companies, like DiDi, like the Ant Group, like Tencent, etc. These, companies have made China into that new model. China have helped China leave that manufacturing for the masses model and become a new technology country. So hitting back at these simultaneously, I know, has created a great deal of unrest. And one wonders, how Xi Jinping is really going to handle his relationship with business. If he is not somebody who wants to pamper these big daddies of business, like was the case right till Xi Jinping. So, that is in terms of responses of the Chinese. I think they too are trying to digest exactly what is happening. Xi Jinping, remember, he starts with an anti-corruption campaign. And now that is a bit of an oxymoron, because everybody is corrupt in China to a certain extent. All Kanpu are implicated. So, the anti-corruption campaign also becomes a past struggle. And he starts strongly right from the beginning. Po Xilai, Zhao Yongkang, these are not nobodies who crawled out from some stone. Po Xilai is a princeling in his own right, and etc., etc. Zhao Yongkang led the secret state. So these are big victims, and he shows his sort of, power right there. He then moves against intellectuals, human rights lawyers, the 7-7 group, the human rights lawyers who've been imprisoned, etc., anybody who's raising a voice. And now he's gone against big capital. Just when, quite interesting, the timing is also something that's very important here, because these are just before their release of their IPOs in the United States. So here I think that she is definitely moving towards absolute control. She doesn't think, and some of the thinkers who are with Xi, quite interestingly, do not think that the private sector is necessary for capitalism. That the Chinese model can actually prove that state capitalism can be a success. After all, many of the Chinese big companies trading on the stock exchange, even in America, etc., are SOEs, but which are following market principles of a market economy. So I think the next, what we really need to watch, where the new relationship that she has brought in, and people's responses both to the pandemic and currently, it can't be seen just as one. And I think people are, from my analysis and having known China for so many years, that people right now are just scared. Fear is a very important component of Xi's rule. Everybody's biding their time. People are waiting to see how things work out. And, you know, the Chinese, as you know, I have great respect for the Chinese, because I think they've, throughout their history, shown a huge capacity to persevere and survive through many ups and downs. And I'm sure that, you know, that will be the case here again. But like I said right at the very beginning of my talk, that there is a certain traditional relationship with the state, which creates for a more uniform, obedient model than you would find in India.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things which you pointed out is very interesting in the sense of talking about the corruption drive which Xi Jinping started in terms of Po Xilai. I think there also, you know, I used to hear a lot of things about Po Xilai being a very good leader. There are zero protests, you know, in the place he was ruling, and all of the, you know, people were quite happy with that. And suddenly we find, you know, this whole corruption thing and a lot of political, you know, things coming out. But having said that, I think, you know, even if the state is making a lot of control over the society, the other aspect which China is trying to project to the world is that it is rooting out absolute poverty, which is what it hailed this last year about the great successes it has achieved in rooting out absolute poverty, which is to one sense is for the welfare of the, you know, masses. And now when China is aiming to be the global superpower, and by 2035 it plans to be a medium-level developed country, in your view, what are the challenges and possibilities to achieve these targets? You know, and well, there will be a push and pull, because we are talking about the economic, you know, slowdown and like that.
Yeah, no, I think that, you know, Xiaohang Shihui, as it's called, this desire to become a middle-class society that Xi Jinping is projecting. And I think, you know, look, despite its very, very totalitarian nature, I do not think that one can deny the enormous transformation that has occurred in the lives of people in China. I traveled in China, for example, in 1982, when I first went to China. Delhi and Bombay were smarter cities. And, you know, look at where we are today. So I think in many ways, the state did fulfill its sort of, one might say, pact with the masses, that we will give you rising standards of living of democracies, which are not true democracies anyway, is how they argue. But obviously poverty is always relative. So if I was to compare poverty in China with India, India would come out much worse. All right, but compared with the domestic economy of China, certainly there are huge problems. For example, Li Keqiang himself pointed out quite recently that more than 60% people in China live on monthly income of approximately 140, 150 US dollars a month, and that is 60%. This, if you couple with the, you know, figures where we look at the Gini coefficient, the difference between the richest and the poorest, which is very high, you know, it's almost at 0.47. One is considered the highest to have extreme inequality. So there is relatively a huge inequality. And that is, you know, I would say that there are 3 levels of inequality that are immediately visible in China. One is, of course, rural-urban. So urban areas, if you compare a city like Shanghai, with a village in Quito, it doesn't matter which index you take, whether it's investment in education and in you name it, health, in education, all the MDI criteria, you know, categories that we normally use to calculate well-being of citizenry, the differences are huge. But so really, then now, because you also have, China also has the largest number of millionaires, you see. So there is a huge difference in terms of inequality. The second most visible aspect of inequality is the position of migrant labor. in China, which is, constantly dealt with very, very harshly. And even the rhetoric of the state against migrant labor is very harsh. They're criminals. China actually effectively has two passports, one for its rural people, which is your hukao, as it's called, your resident permit, and your urban hukao. And this fight to get an urban hukao, it can be a life and death struggle for many, many migrants. I know many people like that, who, especially because the migrants do not get access to any of the sort of compulsory social security state services that are provided to urban residents. They also miss out on anything that the their rural hukaos might provision them with, because they're living in urban areas. So these kind of inequality. Then look at the kind of employment that is being created. You can't really blame the youth for wanting to sort of thumping, to lie flat, because the main economic sort of kind of employment is what they call linghuo. Flexible employment, which carries with it no security of any sort, where you are working what Jack Ma made famous, 996. 9 hours every day, 6 days a week, literally. So it's kind of very, I don't think that all of China will become a middle-class society. Its coastal regions, the upper classes in Shenzhen, Shanghai, Beijing, Nanjing, their lifestyles are already equal to the lifestyles of people in the West. Similarly, in India, you have huge inequalities. The Indian elite also have lifestyles commensurate with the Western middle classes, and yet you have. So these inequalities are really starting to happen. Now, the interesting thing is, will Xi Jinping use the prevalence of these inequalities to further cement his Marxian credentials by going after big business? That's always popular, taking down the richy rich, all in the name of the people. So will this help Xi Jinping cement his position, or will it make life harder for the people as the economy slow down? There's literally an economic Cold War happening between America and China, even if it hasn't reached a direct strategic Cold War element yet, even though I think it has. That's something that's debatable. So I think, and then on top of that, the pandemic. Even though China's economy is bounced back very quickly, they have excellent basis for the economy. But how much stimulus can the state keep giving? China's remedy is always going to give $1 trillion stimulus. How many roads can you keep building? How many empty apartment blocks in cities can you keep building, you see? So I think there is a catch-22. And in many ways, unfortunately for Xi, as markets abroad start, tightening, which even though they've had the highest investment capital, doesn't really care for color of ideology, as long as they can, after all, Apple and Tesla are still very much manufacturing in China, despite everything that's happened. But there is a limit to China would need to create a vibrant domestic economy to handle all of this. Unfortunately, wages have stagnated. Employment is with less security. And at the same time, you are cutting down on conspicuous consumption everywhere. Xi's rhetoric is to whether it's banquets for foreign visitors, whether it's conspicuous consumption is a form of corruption now in China. So you're actually dampening the domestic market because the party and its sort of outlay and expenditure was a major part of keeping the consumer economy going in China. So I think that, not quite sure where Xi Jinping is going with this. I think like the Chinese, we're all in a wait and watch moment with Xi Jinping.
One of the constant factors that you've been highlighting in your argument is, there is a revision or revival of what Mao used to do in terms of governance and administration, and Xi Jinping is really looking back at that. And many of the China watchers also believe that much has changed. Rather, China is moving towards a regressive orthodox style of governance, which is somewhat similar to Mao Zedong era. But in your opinion, what are the similarities and differences, to be or precise, at that period of time? And how do you see President Xi Jinping's style of governance and administration?
No, I think there's a huge difference actually between Mao and Xi. What Xi is doing is that at the level of ideology, he's creating, clear boundaries between Marxism and Chinese thought, which includes Mao Zedong and now his own thought, and Western ideas and thought, which include, concepts of human, all of which comes out of what we call that Enlightenment period, the rights of man, justice, equality, fraternity, all of these ideas. So, even in terms of controlling the teaching of these subjects in China. But at the same time, he's not unleashing a whole-scale cultural war. Secondly, the contours of his culture. Mao built a different nationalism. Mao's nationalism was a peasant revolution. That was a function that totally turned everything upside down. That throughout the old, the search, the four olds, as it was called, including culture. Xi Jinping is doing no such thing. His nationalism is actually being built along the contours of Marxism plus traditional Chinese thought. So one might actually call it Marxian Confucianism. Xi Jinping himself has been taking lessons in Confucianism. There's a constant surge of seminars on Confucian thought, etc., etc., etc. So in that sense, the content is quite different. The form is quite different. She absolutely does not believe in mass campaigns or mass movements, or even going to the masses. She's very clear of a vertical top-down control mechanism. And she has at his disposal the new technology that he is using so well to exercise control. Today, my last visit to China, which was 2 years ago now, I barely saw police on the streets. There's so much self-censorship. There are cameras everywhere. And there's so much self-censorship now in China, which probably doesn't need mass movements. If you see what I mean. Mao actually, in many ways, in his own mind was a democrat. When he was attacking the headquarters during the Cultural Revolution, he truly felt he was carrying out a necessary democratic war among, that would recreate a bourgeois or traditional ideology. She has no such illusions and no such goals. His goal is quite clear. And, today the saying in China is really, Mao is not, discarded at all. He's considered as a very important, he sees himself as the third in line. So it's like Mao Zedong 站起来了, Mao made us stand up. 当我们扶起来了, Deng made us rich. 我们强起来了, she is making us strong. So she has taken on himself the mantle in this pantheon of, seeing it in that sense as a natural development from standing up, becoming rich to now becoming strong. And she sees as his goal becoming strong. The danger with this, his own definition of strength, is China at the center of the world. Whether it's the One Belt, One Road, or what I most worry about, and I keep having this dialogue with friends in Taiwan, I really think Taiwan is going to, unfortunately, face the brunt of Xi's desire for strength. He's emphasized, there's one thing that's radically different in Xi's rhetoric and the past rhetoric of China's leaders on Taiwan, is that Xi has categorically stated that force will be used if necessary. And this Tatong, this unification of China, is now in many ways the last dream of the communists, and they would have full by 2050. And that is why India must worry too, because we must not take lightly the discourse on Arunachal Pradesh. I often think that we spend too much energy on Leh Ladakh and far too little on Arunachal Pradesh, which China over and over again claims as a part of China. India is the only border it hasn't decided. So I think India must really be very, very careful with Xi Jinping and his goals, with strength as the underlying metaphor, and unity of the nation. You know, this grand taton, and not just unity of the Chinese along this territorially contiguous, ever-expanding boundary, but also across the Tianxia, hence the use of Confucianism. You know, it's 中国文化天下, the world Chinese civilization. He's constantly appealing to the overseas Chinese community, and quite frankly, the horrible racism that you know, East Asians have faced in post-pandemic in America. You know, especially with Trump calling it the China virus and things like that. That kind of catcalling has in many ways strengthened the call of you know, necessity to be a strong identity of Chinese all over, with China and the mainland, the Zukuo, the motherland, you know, the fatherland, so the ancestral land, as that core principle of identity.
Yeah, when you know, Xi Jinping is talking about you know, reviving China or rejuvenating China, he's talking about also this identity as the core. But having said that, and you really pointed about India in that context, one of the things we hear a lot about is, you know, aging China and young India. So in one sense, you know, India is going to be much more powerful. So how do you see this comparison? What are the advantages
you know,
for India?
I really wish that India would genuinely learn some of the good things from China, in terms of you know, emphasis on infrastructure development. China's Fuxing, this rejuvenation that Xi Jinping keeps talking about, a lot of that has to do with infrastructure. America is bringing in that stimulus package under Biden by trying to bring out a bipartisan infrastructure plan. India still needs a lot of catching up to do. We need to start being realistic. India is too caught up in itself. We are constantly harking back to the past, to past glory. You know, we need to look, I think, more to the future. Do we want to be a 21st century power, or do we want to go back to medievalism and be a power in mind only and a power in mythology only? There is a material aspect to power that I think India needs to better capture. You know, there's a very interesting saying or story about Margaret Thatcher when she came back from her first visit to America. She was asked by a member of the press that, what do you think is the main difference between America and England? And she turned around and said, well, to me it was clear. In England, we're always looking at the past. We're always going back to our past glory, the great empire, etc. But in America, they look to the future, about landing on the moon and perhaps on Mars. So really, that is where China is a very practical, hard power country. It puts its money where its mouth is. If the Chinese, given that they are this single-minded regime, you know, and they have very little value for human rights, for individuals as such, that is not part of that composite. They don't give that much value. And even traditionally, they would argue that, you know, not the individual, but the family or the kin group or the clan, or, you know, that has always been the more important relationship, rather than that individualism is purely a Western idea. That is not the case in India. In India, we've always had a very strong tradition of being individuals, having individual opinions, multiple, even traditionally, look at the debates even within Hinduism, for example. We've always been a pluralistic, multicultural country, and India becomes a nation organically. You know, under the British Empire, literally Lord Curzon gives us some modern day boundaries. We do get to becoming a nation organically, despite all the various rajas and etc. China's nationhood has always been top down, the empire downwards. So I think, you know, there are crucial differences between India and China. But one of our biggest failings is that we spend too much time on abstract thought. Maybe right from the very beginning, if China invents the compass, India invents the zero. These are two, you know, material and conceptual mindsets. We need to perhaps start focusing more on real material hard power. And I think we've made the right decision to activate the Quad, because I think India always naturally does well in a multilateral environment and in multilateral groupings. And I think that that is an excellent way to start telling China that, look, we are going to look for whatever means at our disposal to not allow you to walk all over us, even though we have lost a great deal of actual power in our own region, whether it's Sri Lanka or it's Nepal. And Pakistan, we know already.
Yeah, very well said. I mean, we can just continue our discussion over that. But in one sense, I think one of the greatest things we need to learn from the Chinese is how that community, notion is built up from the, Mao time to now, where, people are not thinking about individual interests, but are thinking of collective interests, of state interests. And that is where the state and the party has played a greater role in society. So it was a great pleasure talking to you and listening to you. I think we can just continue listening to you a lot, but we'll continue with that in our future interactions. Thank you to our viewers. Please keep watching and listen to our programs. Keep learning. Namaste.
Thank you. Thank you again, Dr. Kocher, for giving me this opportunity to interact with you on this new and rather interesting forum.